You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain you're the toughest guy in the room. So you walk up to what looks like the smallest, weakest person there and throw a punch only to discover you just picked a fight with a trained killer who's been waiting his whole life for someone to underestimate him. That's exactly what happened when the Ming dynasty decided to invade Vietnam in 1407. Except instead of a bar fight, this was a 20-year nightmare that turned into one of the most humiliating military disasters in Chinese history. Picture this. You're the Yongle Emperor, ruler of the most powerful empire on Earth. You've got 1 million soldiers, the world's largest navy, gunpowder weapons that can level cities, and you've just finished building the Forbidden City to remind everyone how incredibly badass you are. Your empire stretches from Korea to Tibet, and every neighbor either pays you tribute or gets crushed. You're basically the medieval equivalent of a superpower, and you know it. Then you look south at this little kingdom called Jai Viet, what we now call Vietnam, and you think, you know what? That place used to be ours. Maybe it's time to remind them who's boss. Big mistake. Huge mistake. The kind of mistake that would make military historians wince for the next 6 centuries. But here's the thing. At the time, it didn't seem like a mistake at all. It seemed like the most logical move in the world. Vietnam had been under Chinese control for over 1,000 years, from about 111 BC to 938 AD. That's longer than America has existed as a country. For a millennium, Vietnam was just another Chinese province, and the Ming emperors figured that somewhere deep down, the Vietnamese still remembered who their real masters were. They were about to learn that some people don't forget being conquered, they just spend every waking moment planning their revenge. The guy who would make this lesson extremely painful for the Chinese was named Le Loi, and his story reads like something out of a fever dream cooked up by Sun Tzu and Che Guevara having a strategy session in hell. Le Loi wasn't born a military genius. He was just a minor noble from Thanh Hoa province, the kind of guy who should have lived a quiet life managing rice paddies and complaining about taxes. But when the Ming invasion rolled into his homeland, something inside him snapped. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a cold, calculating fury that would turn him into one of history's most effective guerrilla commanders. The invasion itself started like most Chinese military operations, overwhelmingly, brutally efficient. The Ming didn't just send an army, they sent a military machine designed to erase Vietnamese resistance so completely that the very idea of independence would become unthinkable. We're talking about 200,000 troops in the initial invasion, supported by the most advanced military technology in the world. Ming crossbowmen who could put bolts through armor at 400 yards, artillery units with cannons that could reduce fortress walls to rubble, cavalry formations that moved like coordinated death across the landscape, naval forces that controlled every major river and coastal approach. The Vietnamese Royal Army, what was left of it, lasted about as long as you'd expect. A few pitched battles, some desperate last stands, and then nothing. The organized resistance simply evaporated. King Ho Quy Lai was captured, his dynasty was extinguished, and the Ming declared Vietnam to be officially Chinese territory once again. Mission accomplished, right? Time to set up some administrators, collect some taxes, and move on to the next conquest. Except the Vietnamese had other plans. Le Loi looked at this situation. His country occupied, his king captured, his people under the boot of foreign invaders, and made a decision that would echo through Vietnamese history for the next 600 years. Instead of accepting defeat like a rational person, he decided to make the Chinese regret ever hearing the word Vietnam. But here's what made Le Loi different from every other resistance leader the Chinese had crushed. He understood that you can't beat a superpower by playing by superpower rules. You don't line up your peasant army against professional soldiers and hope for the best. You don't try to match their technology or their numbers. You turn their strengths into weaknesses, and you make them fight a war they don't know how to win. The Chinese were brilliant at conventional warfare. They could siege cities, they could win pitched battles, they could coordinate massive armies across vast distances. But they had no idea how to deal with an enemy who refused to give them targets to destroy. Le Loi's genius was realizing that Vietnam itself was his greatest weapon. Think about the geography we're dealing with here. Vietnam isn't some open plain where you can maneuver massive armies and use superior firepower to crush resistance. It's a narrow, mountainous country covered in dense jungle, with rivers that flood unpredictably and terrain that can swallow armies whole. The kind of place where a local farmer who knows every trail and hidden valley is worth more than 1,000 professional soldiers who are lost the moment they leave the main roads. Le Loi started small, really small. In 1418, 11 years after the invasion, he raised what historians politely call a peasant army. In reality, it was maybe a few hundred guys armed with farm tools, stolen weapons, and a burning hatred for their occupier. Any rational military analysis would have given them about a week before they were all dead or captured. Instead, they became the Ming dynasty's worst nightmare. The beauty of Le Loi's strategy was its simplicity. Don't fight battles you can't win. Do fight battles where the enemy can't use their advantages. Attack supply convoys, not fortified positions. Hit them when they're moving, not when they're ready. Disappear into the jungle before they can bring their superior firepower to bear. The Chinese called it banditry. Le Loi called it war. The first few years were brutal. We're talking about a resistance movement that was literally living in caves and eating roots to survive. Every time they showed themselves in the open, Ming forces would crush them. Every village that helped them would be burned to the ground. Every captured rebel would be executed as an example to others. But something strange started happening. Instead of breaking the resistance, the Chinese brutality was actually strengthening it. See, the Ming had made a fundamental miscalculation about Vietnamese psychology. They assumed that enough violence would eventually convince the locals to accept Chinese rule as the natural order of things. What they didn't understand was that every atrocity they committed created 10 new rebels, and every village they burned became a recruiting sting for Le Loi's growing army. By 1420, what had started as a few hundred desperate peasants had grown into a proper insurgency. Thousands of fighters operating in coordinated cells across the northern provinces. Supply networks that could move weapons and information through jungle paths the Chinese didn't even know existed. Intelligence operations that meant the rebels often knew about Ming troop movements before the Ming commanders did. And Le Loi, he was learning, fast. Every engagement taught him something new about how the Chinese fought, how they thought, where they were vulnerable. He started studying captured Chinese military manuals, interrogating prisoners about Ming tactics, analyzing every aspect of how the occupation forces operated. What he discovered was that the Chinese, for all their military genius, had a crucial weakness. They were fighting the wrong war. The Ming were set up to win massive, decisive battles against conventional enemies. Their entire military doctrine was based on overwhelming force applied at specific points to achieve quick, total victory. They were the ancient equivalent of a heavyweight boxer, incredibly powerful, but only if they could land a clean hit. Le Loi was fighting like a mosquito, impossible to pin down, constantly annoying, and slowly bleeding his enemy to death. The turning point came in 1424, when Le Loi pulled off one of the most audacious military operations in Vietnamese history. The Chinese had been trying to corner his main force for months, sending column after column into the mountains of Thanh Hoa province. Every time they thought they had him trapped, Le Loi would vanish into terrain that the Chinese maps didn't even accurately depict. Finally, a Ming general named Wang Tong decided to end this once and for all. He assembled a force of 30,000 professional soldiers, more troops than many entire kingdoms could field, and marched them into the highlands with orders to find Le Loi and destroy him completely. It was exactly the kind of conventional military thinking that Le Loi had been waiting for. Instead of running, he did something that seemed like tactical suicide. He concentrated almost his entire army in one location and waited for Wang Tong to find him. The Chinese were ecstatic. Finally, a decisive battle. Finally, a chance to use their superior numbers and training to end this irritating rebellion once and for all. Wang Tong's 30,000 men marched into what they thought was a trap for the rebels. It was actually a trap for them. Le Loi had chosen his battlefield with surgical precision. A narrow valley surrounded by steep hills covered in dense jungle. The kind of place where superior numbers became meaningless because you couldn't deploy them effectively. Where heavy armor became a liability because the terrain was too rough for mounted charges. Where the Chinese artillery couldn't find targets because the enemy kept disappearing behind trees and rocks. The Battle of Chai Lung Sha wasn't really a battle in the conventional sense. It was more like a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The Chinese army marched into the valley in perfect formation, expecting to find a desperate peasant force that they could crush with a single, overwhelming assault. Instead, they found themselves in a killing ground that had been prepared with the patience of a master craftsman. Vietnamese crossbowmen using weapons they'd stolen from previous Chinese defeats opened fire from concealed positions on the hillsides. But they weren't trying to win a conventional archery duel. They were targeting officers, specialists, anyone whose death would create confusion in the Chinese ranks. Meanwhile, Le Loi's infantry was doing something that violated every rule of medieval warfare. They were refusing to stand and fight. Every time the Chinese tried to charge a position, the Vietnamese would melt away into the jungle, only to reappear moments later, attacking from a completely different direction. The psychological impact on the Chinese troops was devastating. These were professional soldiers who had trained their entire lives for conventional warfare. They knew how to fight enemy armies, but they had no idea how to fight an enemy that acted more like a force of nature than a military unit. For 3 days, Wang Tong's army thrashed around in that valley, burning through their supplies and their morale as they chased an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Chinese soldiers started to crack under the pressure of constant, unpredictable attacks. Units began to lose cohesion as men realized that their training and experience were useless in this nightmare landscape. On the 4th day, Le Loi sprung the final part of his trap. While the Chinese had been focused on trying to find and destroy his main force, Vietnamese sappers had been quietly working to block the valley's main exit. When Wang Tong finally realized his situation was hopeless and ordered a retreat, he discovered that his army was trapped. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a rout. 30,000 professional Chinese soldiers, some of the finest troops in the world, were systematically destroyed by an enemy force that was probably less than half their size. Wang Tong himself was killed, along with most of his senior officers. The survivors who made it out of the valley did so by abandoning their weapons, their armor, and any pretense of military discipline. They stumbled back to Chinese-controlled territory as broken men, carrying tales of an enemy that fought like demons and vanished like ghosts. The news of the disaster sent shockwaves through the Ming command structure. How do you explain to the emperor that you just lost 30,000 troops to a bunch of Vietnamese peasants? How do you justify the complete destruction of a professional army by an enemy that shouldn't have been able to compete with Chinese military superiority? But for Le Loi, Chi Sa was just the beginning. The victory had given him something more valuable than captured weapons or strategic territory. It had proven that the Chinese could be beaten. Word spread across Vietnam like wildfire. The invincible Ming army wasn't so invincible after all. Recruitment for the resistance exploded. Whole provinces that had been collaborating with the Chinese occupation suddenly found their loyalties shifting. Local officials who had been enforcing Ming rule started quietly passing information to the rebels. The carefully constructed puppet government that the Chinese had established began to crack apart. By 1425, what had started as a localized peasant uprising had become a full-scale national insurgency. Vietnamese forces were operating openly in large areas of the country. Chinese garrisons found themselves besieged in their own fortresses. Supply convoys required massive military escorts just to move between major cities. The Ming were discovering something that would become a familiar lesson for future empires. Controlling territory is very different from controlling people. They could occupy cities. They could hold strategic points. They could even win most of the battles they fought. But they couldn't make the Vietnamese stop fighting. Every village they pacified would rebel again the moment their troops moved on. Every collaborative government they established would collapse as soon as the rebels showed up. Emperor Yongle, the man who had ordered this invasion, died in 1424, ironically, while on campaign against the Mongols in the north. His son, the Hongxi Emperor, inherited a war that was devouring Chinese resources and prestige with no end in sight. The new emperor tried a different approach: negotiation. In 1427, Chinese diplomats approached Le Loi with an offer. The Ming would recognize Vietnamese independence in exchange for nominal tributary status. Vietnam could govern itself, but it would acknowledge Chinese supremacy and pay annual tribute. For most resistance leaders, this would have been an acceptable compromise. Vietnam would be independent in all but name, and the killing could finally stop. Le Loi's response was essentially, "Go fuck yourselves." Not because he was unreasonable, but because he understood something that the Chinese diplomats didn't. He was winning. The Ming occupation was collapsing, Chinese morale was shattered, and every month that passed made the Vietnamese position stronger. Why settle for nominal independence when total victory was within reach? The final phase of the war was almost anticlimactic. By 1427, the Chinese position had become untenable. They were holding a few major cities and the main transportation routes, but the countryside belonged entirely to the Vietnamese. Chinese soldiers couldn't venture outside their fortifications without being attacked. Supply lines were constantly under assault. The local population was openly hostile. The Ming had two choices: commit massive additional resources to a war that was already draining their treasury, or cut their losses and withdraw. In 1428, they chose withdrawal. But even the retreat became a humiliation. The Chinese had to negotiate safe passage for their remaining troops through territory controlled by the very peasant bandits they had come to crush. Le Loi, in a gesture that was equal parts magnanimous and insulting, agreed to let the Chinese armies leave unmolested, provided they left behind all their military equipment. The final Chinese garrison sailed away from Vietnam in ships that were loaded with defeated soldiers, but empty of the weapons, artillery, and military supplies they had brought to conquer a small kingdom. 20 years after their invasion began, the Ming were leaving Vietnam poorer, weaker, and humiliated. Le Loi became Emperor Le Thai To, founder of the Le dynasty that would rule Vietnam for the next 360 years. The Chinese, well, they pretended that the whole Vietnam adventure had never really been that important anyway. But the real impact of this disaster went far beyond just Vietnamese independence. The Ming defeat in Vietnam sent shockwaves across East Asia. If the mighty Chinese Empire could be humbled by a small kingdom, what did that say about Chinese power in general? Other tributary states started to question whether they really needed to be so deferential to Beijing. Regional powers began to calculate whether Chinese threats were as credible as they had seemed. The psychological impact on China itself was even more profound. The Ming had built their legitimacy partly on the idea that they were restoring Chinese greatness after overthrowing the foreign Mongol Yuan dynasty. They were supposed to be the return of authentic Chinese power and prestige. Losing a war to Vietnam, a place that had been Chinese territory for a millennium, suggested that maybe the Ming weren't quite as great as they claimed to be. The Vietnamese victory also established a template for resisting Chinese expansion that would influence military thinking throughout the region for centuries. The idea that a smaller, weaker country could defeat a much larger empire through guerrilla warfare, superior local knowledge, and sheer determination became a source of inspiration for other independence movements. But here's what really gets me about this story. Le Loi didn't just beat the Chinese militarily, he outthought them strategically. The Ming went into Vietnam thinking they were going to fight a conventional war against a conventional enemy. They prepared for siege warfare, pitched battles, and the kind of large-scale military operations that had made them successful against other opponents. Le Loi realized that the Chinese expected him to fight like a Chinese army, so he did the opposite. He fought like Vietnam itself, unpredictable, patient, seemingly weak, but actually incredibly resilient. He turned every Chinese strength into a vulnerability and every Chinese assumption into a trap. The Chinese had superior numbers. Le Loi made sure they could never bring those numbers to bear effectively. The Chinese had better weapons. He stole them and used them against their former owners. The Chinese had more experience. He made sure that experience was useless in the environment where they were actually fighting. Most importantly, Le Loi understood that this wasn't really a military war, it was a political war. The Chinese could win every battle and still lose if they couldn't convince the Vietnamese people to accept Chinese rule. So instead of trying to protect the population from Chinese brutality, he used that brutality as a recruitment tool. Every Chinese atrocity created more rebels. Every village they burned became a symbol of resistance. Every prisoner they executed became a martyr who inspired others to take up arms. By the end of the war, the Chinese weren't just fighting Le Loi's army, they were fighting the entire Vietnamese nation. And no empire, no matter how powerful, can win a war against an entire people who refuse to be conquered. The Ming defeat in Vietnam became one of those historical events that everyone prefers to forget, but no one can actually ignore. Chinese historians downplayed it, calling it a temporary setback or a strategic withdrawal. Vietnamese historians celebrated it as the moment their country proved it could never be truly conquered. Both versions miss the real lesson. Sometimes the strongest army in the world isn't strong enough to win a war it shouldn't have started in the first place. The Ming learned this lesson the hard way. After 1428, they never again attempted to directly occupy and control Vietnam. They would influence Vietnamese politics, they would extract tribute, they would occasionally threaten military action, but they never again tried to turn Vietnam into a Chinese province. Because Le Loi had taught them something about the difference between conquering a country and controlling it. You can occupy cities, you can win battles, you can even capture kings. But if the people themselves refuse to be conquered, all the military superiority in the world won't save you from eventual defeat. The Vietnamese would remember this lesson too. Centuries later, when the French came with modern weapons and colonial ambitions, they would face the same kind of resistance that had destroyed the Ming occupation. When the Americans came with helicopters and napalm, they would discover that superior technology doesn't guarantee victory against an enemy that treats resistance as a way of life. Each time, the invaders would learn what the Ming learned in 1428, that there are some places in the world that simply cannot be conquered, no matter how powerful you think you are. Vietnam is one of those places, and Le Loi was the man who proved it.